Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Fat Muscle Project podcast. I'm John Gorman, your host today. We got Lisa Franz in the house. Lisa, what's going on? How are you?
Hi, John. I'm so excited to talk to you. And we were just speaking about your exciting news at the moment that you just opened your 50th retail location. I'm super, super stoked for you.
Yeah, we with the Fat Muscle Project supplement company, for those of you that are watching that aren't familiar with who we are, we're a supplement company and obviously we run a podcast as well. And we just had our 50th location bring our supplements in-house. So stores, gyms, trainers, all kinds of different locations carry us. So just in 4 short years, we were able to hit 50, and we actually have hit 51 since then. Just a couple days later, we added number 51. So yeah, a lot of exciting stuff happening, but not as exciting about is your presentation that you've got today. So you did this for the first time at the Fat Muscle Academy, our in-person seminar. We do those every single year for our customers, and we also make it open to the public, and it's how to bring up a lagging body part. And I remember when I got with you to come speak at our event, I remember seeing your pictures. I remember seeing everything that you had gone through to bring up glutes and in turn, hamstrings and everything else that came up with it. I remember seeing your pictures and like, hey, you need to give a presentation on this because a lot of people can talk about how to bring them up and they can talk about the science and everything, which I know you will, and like the XYZs, but you did it in such a fashion to where nothing will get people's attention more than a before and after picture, right? So like, and the process. So I'm super super excited to basically be a spectator today and watch you. And the things I'm going to do on my end is I'm going to think of questions that probably our listeners or people watching on YouTube would think of and ask those as we go. So whenever you're ready, Lisa, we can you can share that over and we can get started.
Amazing. Yeah, and I'm gonna try to keep it obviously audio friendly as well for those of you just listening.
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, so when you invited me to come and speak at the Fat Muscle Academy in January, I felt super honored, and I mentioned to you and also at the time when I presented this that at first a little bit of imposter syndrome set in, and I thought, okay, what do I actually have to talk to a room full of seasoned bodybuilders or even other coaches and much more in the physique space than I was or consider myself at. I much more consider myself someone, in the general population who wants to still optimize their physique as best as possible. And I have much more of a probably like quote unquote functional fitness background, CrossFit background, but functional fitness, etc. So yeah, I was not necessarily doubting myself, but I just thought, what can I contribute or just tell people here that they might not already know, or just offer a little bit of a different perspective. And then after some contemplating and also talking to my mentor about it, he was like, hey, Lisa, look at this as a strength. This is actually something different. People don't need to hear over and over again from the same sort of source or from the same sort of angle, but you are offering a little bit of a different view. So again, just to provide a bit of a background story. So I started CrossFit 2014. Before that, I was mostly doing like swimming, running, yoga, that kind of thing. So I definitely don't have I never grew up lifting or thinking I wanted to lift heavy weights. But when I then started CrossFit, I actually, like so many people, fell in love with it. And because it's so variety of it, the community of it, all these different things. But also, like so many people, I really overdid it. Like I'm very competitive by nature. So pulling back and just thinking to myself, today I'm gonna, not push myself to the limit. That never occurred to me. I just thought I needed to go balls to the walls all the time. So needless to say, I got injured, multiple little things, like something on my wrist, something on my neck. But also a little bit of my lower back. And so I had to transition out of it and got more into just pure strength training. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we were all kind of forced to modify our training. But even there, with the training that I was doing purely strength wise, I was almost always pushing myself to the maximum, lifting way too heavy. And I never realized that I was actually not able to properly engage or feel my glutes. It was just, getting the weight up, no matter how. That might have been with a bad form, that might have been just with my back, with my hamstrings, but never really knowing like how do I actually activate this part. And so I had a bit of a sciatic nerve inflammation from 2020 onwards, essentially, through my training, through everything else, and basically had to really reduce my training even further. From previously doing 3 lower body days a week to only doing 2, and even within that, really reducing the volume as well. So it was a lot of unilateral stuff, not very heavy, and because of that, I lost even more of my glute musculature. Well, then fast forward to 2022, I finally was pain-free with a lot of rehabbing it. And also, to be honest, for those of you listening who might have been struggling with sciatica themselves, also unfortunately, really just having to dial back. Like there's no way full training through sciatica full on without modifying it and just thinking with a little bit of foam rolling, a little bit of physio, you're gonna get that nerve not to be inflamed. So anyway, it worked though, 2 years of being patient and pulling back. And then 2022, I thought, well, okay, I actually want to bring this muscle back up because, well, aesthetically, I noticed how much it had gone down and it was bothering me that it was kind of disproportional. I have a very strong upper body, in my opinion, but definitely the lower body fell behind, or particularly the glutes. And also because someone that whose opinion I value very much said to me, at least I don't mean this to sound offensive or anything like this, but you are getting a little bit disproportional. I think you have great potential in many aspects. He actually got me to think about stepping on stage, which this thought I ditched since then. But at the time, I thought about it for a few months. Um, Anyway, he encouraged me to speak to a few other coaches in the physique space, and everyone said, hey, your glutes are really, really, underdeveloped. You should do a glute specialization cycle. And so I started doing that with just a generic program. I actually think it was a program by Jeff Nippards. And then after a few months, I got a coach to actually write a program for me. So first point for my why, this is why I'm sharing this. I do think people need to have a strong why when they want to make any kind of changes. But even when it comes to wanting to bring up a particular body part, like knowing what your why is can always be helpful. So for me, it was my injury had healed. I finally felt strong. I finally felt like I could actually do a lot of these movements again that would allow me to bring up the glutes, because when I was still struggling with sciatica, I could not have done so much, specific exercises, which I'm going to go into as well. And the other reason being to bring out muscular imbalances. I noticed that it was affecting me, that I had more lower back pain because of my weaker glutes, my right side in particular, even weaker. And then, of course, for some more or less, well, not necessarily vain reasons, but for aesthetic reasons, let's say. So those three were my why I wanted to embark on this journey. And that was September 2022 when I decided to get started with this. So,
Can you go back to the last
of
slide for
course,
those
yeah.
people watching on YouTube here? Um, what's the time frame difference between this before and after? And then I want to talk about a little bit of this real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is exactly a year actually. So September 2022 forwarding, no, sorry, December 2023. So a year and 2 months and 3 months.
Okay, so for people watching on YouTube, if you look real close at this before and after picture, it's extremely profound. The picture on the left, obviously you can tell that you train, you work very hard, but if you notice how much your glutes came up, your hamstrings, your quads came up, even though we're looking at a back picture here, this is so crucial, and not very many people listening are going to want to step on stage. But for those people that do want to step on stage and do any class literally as a female, glutes are judged, hamstrings are judged, quads are judged. Like this back pose is judged And I have a lot of people that come to me and they're Lisa on the left. They're Lisa that has a lagging body part where glutes and hams need to come up. And they don't realize that they need to spend this amount of time doing these things that you're about to break down. But just for anyone in general that wants to bring up their glutes, this is going to be great. And I also want to say one more thing too. I don't want to lose our guys here because these principles that you talk about, because I've seen this presentation, it applies to any body part. So if you're a guy wanting to bring up your chest, you need to listen to all these things Lisa's about to outline. Even though we specifically hone in on your transformation with your lower half, I think that's probably important to say. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, most of the principles definitely will apply to any kind of body part for sure. And also having a why, if you want to bring up your chest, like, okay, why is that? Is that still going to look symmetric? Is that still going to be functional? Is that going to pull your shoulders forward more, etc. Like, so having a strong why is definitely helpful. So yeah, let's get into the how I did it. So of course, in order to support my body with putting on muscle, I did go into a small calorie surplus. It was about 10% of my maintenance calories. And I also talked about this previously that I was quite afraid of going into this. This was my first time consciously going into a calorie surplus. Of course, prior to having, so at that stage, I had been tracking macros for 6 years when I started this, and I had never been in a calorie surplus specifically. So it was quite terrifying for me, and I actually started really slowly. So for anyone out there who is also scared of, oh, I'm going to put on a ton of weight right away, I specifically thought, okay, I want to put on no more than about half a pound or a pound maximum per month. So that's a very conservative approach in my opinion, and probably, or for someone who has hypothetically been doing some kind of resistance training for a while, but it was more like half a pound to a pound per month that I was aiming for. And initially the first few weeks I literally just bumped up my calories by 50, and then I, stepping on the scales, I built my confidence and like, okay, I'm still not fat. This is okay. You can actually increase your calories. And of course, I try to be smart about it too, because many people go into calorie surplus and then the calories that they add in are from crappy foods, and then that causes them to feel crappier, and then they blame the surplus, even though it's just what they ate, or they're not as mindful of it anymore. So I mostly added those calories around my training, um, one step at a time, as I mentioned, until I got to this roughly 10% surplus, which I then actually, after a while, bumped up to 15% overall. But yeah, still very quote unquote clean foods, rice, oats, a little bit of extra fruit and so on. And I switched back to 3 days of lower body. So if glutes are not the body part that you want to bring up, whichever part you want to train, most of the time it might require you to increase the volume. For me, that was most certainly the case. I did more isolation work too, and that is a very big part for me, coming from more of a quote unquote functional space. So doing less barbell work, doing less compounds. Yes, I was still doing leg press. I was still doing Smith machine squats, actually, because it supported my lower back a little bit better, and hack squats as well, as opposed to free barbell squats, which I don't really do that much anymore. And a lot more just machine work. So up until that point, or maybe a little bit before that, I was mostly doing like, or sometimes training out of a CrossFit gym, or again throughout the pandemic with free weights at home and so on. So being in a gym and really focusing on things like abductions, as the hip thrust machine, as even leg curls, leg extensions, kickbacks, and that was reasonably new to me, and that might sound like a no-brainer to many of you guys, but for me, the eye-opener was just that I was a lot less fatigued, even though I was doing more volume. And you and I have spoken about this a number of times also, that finding that optimal recoverable volume is so crucial, and that doesn't necessarily always mean reducing the time that you spend in the gym or the time, the amount of sets that you do, but it can sometimes just be swapping out those exercises that are more taxing. For instance, if you deadlift really heavy every single week, that's going to be a lot more taxing than if you say, hey, I'm going to put those in there once a month, and maybe on the other weeks I'm gonna do single leg RDLs. I'm gonna do other things, maybe Smith machine good mornings, etc., which are not quite as taxing for my nervous system. So that was yeah, a big part for me as well, for sure. And in particular, the glute medius was something that I really focused on because the lack of strength in that muscle in particular, for me personally, was a contributor to the sciatica flare up. At the same time, though, if I would train the glute medius too much, it would re-aggravate the sciatica. So I really had to stay on top of that throughout this entire time, which meant foam rolling, which meant going in there with a sort of like a mobility ball, probably for like 10 minutes, both of these things combined, 10 minutes every single day. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but most people, again, are not consistent with the work that they do. They might do like half an hour once a week, but it's more about the consistency because we sit every day, which aggravates things like sciatica. We get into weird lopsided positions, which can aggravate things like sciatica. So really, it's the regularity more than anything. The other thing which is mentioned here in this presentation too is high rep ranges. And it wasn't like before that I was training like a power lifter. So by no means was I just doing 1 to 3 reps, but I would move quite frequently more in the 5 to 8 rep range. Sort of zone, which, 8 reps can be considered a hypertrophy range also, but I definitely switched more with this approach. I switched more to 10 upwards, 10 all the way to 20. Again, being somewhat new for me. So training a lot more glycolytically and therefore also reducing spinal loading, reducing just CNS fatigue, in my opinion, as well. And then the last point that's noted on here as well is I really focused on mind-muscle connection. So as I mentioned in the beginning, if you would have told me to activate my glutes, I probably just would have squeezed my butt cheeks. But if it's like, hey, during a squat, can you actually feel your glutes engage? I would have probably had to say no. Or even during something like a hip thrust, I felt it in my quads and I felt it in my hamstrings, even though my setup hypothetically to an outside trainer looked okay. It's not like my feet were really out or were really too far in, but I just couldn't connect to it. And so eventually what actually helped with that was definitely the higher rep ranges, what was a lot of tempo work, so reducing it. And for all of this, I'm going to mention that later on again, also for all of this, the hardest thing for me was to put my ego back.
Yeah.
Like, because, you have this something in mind where you're like, oh, I used to be able to do, I don't know, this and that amount of squats at 150 pounds, or I used to be able to put the thing here and there for leg press or for abduction. And even though no one's watching, it's not like anyone actually cares other than myself. But for me, it was like, oh, I can't really be doing this exercise at this teeny tiny amount of weight. It felt like a step back, but it didn't take very long until I realized, whoa, okay, I can actually feel this body part now, and I can
Yeah.
actually feel the difference too between, oh, my glute medius is working more that now, and this is targeting more my lower butt, or rather than the glute medius or whatever. So it was really, really eye-opening, and I do think um, improving mind-muscle connection can be so helpful for actually bringing up any body part. Like often lats, for instance, I've talked about this too, that was another body part I've struggled to engage, and learning to feel mind muscle connection to my lats definitely has been a big game changer for me as well. I don't know if you would agree with that, with the
Oh
mind
yeah.
muscle.
100%. It's one of those things to where combining the higher reps, to help activate a little bit more mind muscle connection. I've seen for people trying to bring up a lagging body part, probably the number one thing. It's
Hmm.
probably the number one thing that I've seen people do that's led to success. So I'm a huge proponent of this.
Awesome. Yeah. And what I will say, and that's not on the slide, I don't know if I put that on the next slide. Yes. So I also will say that for me, in order to help with the mind muscle connection, using something like a weight belt actually really helped. So when my coach at the time suggested it, well, she actually suggested a waist trainer, and I was like, I laughed at that. I was like, I'm not going to use a waist trainer. I want to have a strong core. I worked hard on these abs, and it just like for me, I always associated a waist trainer with that's just a silly sort of fad, and why are people doing this in the first place? It's not going to do anything. But then she also said, okay, if you're not using a waist trainer, at least use a weight belt more often. Because I used to use a weight belt in CrossFit from time to time as well, like
Yeah.
when you're doing those really heavy things or you're going for your one rep maxes, etc. But more so for the purpose of like using my core even more, of like breathing into the belt, whereas now I was using it to take my core more out of the movement, so to engage the core actually less, because unlike many people, my core was always hyper engaged. Same with my pelvic floor, hyper engaged, and therefore learning to not use the core quite as much allowed my glutes to work a lot more. And I think that that applies to many body parts too, right? Like you might, if you're not using your lats properly, you're probably compensating with maybe your rhomboids or with your biceps or your triceps or so during certain movements, and learning to disengage certain muscles can really help us engage the right ones more correctly. Again, that in some movements that meant I had to reduce the weight, but overall it really made a huge difference. So it doesn't mean that I'm now doing upper body work with a weight belt for the most part. It did mean that for basically all squats, all kind of lunges, all sort of deadlifts, even during hip thrusts, I am using the weight belt because I don't want my core working too hard. And for those people that are watching, so just in this picture here from one side to another, you can see that my core is very strong, but probably like especially if you're I always say I want to train like a bikini athlete, even though I don't have any aspirations of stepping on stage. And I most certainly do not have a bikini athlete waist. Um, it is more of a CrossFitter type of waist. So that's certainly something that I wanted to reduce a little bit, as silly as that might sound. But I think also that was quite successful. So for instance, in this back picture, even you can also see that the waist did get smaller, and it looks more like a more desirable hourglass figure. I just naturally have more of a square slash rectangular frame as opposed to an hourglass figure. So yes, that certainly helped, as silly as it might sometimes sound. The other few bonus things that I did in order to help facilitate a hypertrophy even more was I really emphasized recovery. I already mentioned the foam rolling and the golf ball or mobility ball kind of going into the muscles. But I also did other things, like I went to the sauna, once or twice a week for the most part. I really still focused on accuracy, and I am someone. I do push very hard. So I would say a majority of time, I don't push to failure all the time, but the majority of time I was most certainly within an 8 or 9 RPE, or one or two sort of RIR, for those of you that are working with that kind of measures. So that would be something that I would absolutely say is crucial in order to push yourself. If you're a newer athlete, if you're newer to strength training, we know, according to the research, that you don't have to go that close to failure. But particularly, at this point, I was 8 years into strength training, even though it wasn't hypertrophy focused training, it was still strength training. So you have to maximize all kinds of areas, which I was doing. I was also being very vigilant with supplements, and I mean, maybe we can talk about that later as well. There was not something major that I changed in terms of my supplement regime, but just consistency. Again, that's another point where people are like, oh yeah, I do take my supplements. Well, maybe three, maybe four times a week or whatever. But what about all the others? It is about consistency. It is about this continuance, particularly with things like creatine, and of course sleep, adding here to the recovery too. But that's something that I've been focusing on for a long time, that's for sure. Um, are there, like, I'm gonna throw that to you, John. Are there any particular things where you were like, those are the little tiny bonuses or dots on the I that people, that your athletes perhaps are missing or sometimes um, not thinking of, and then they change that and then they improve that, and it really helps them bring something up, or just in general kickstart their hypertrophy?
Yeah, basically all of the stuff that you've just laid out is such a good deep dive into all the little tiny details, especially if someone is listening and they're wanting to really bring up the lower half. Like all those little things are little nuggets. Those are the things when we listen to presentations where, a lot of people that have been around a while, they hear things like, okay, higher reps and a little more isolation work, and maybe even like I have clients do some pre-exhaustion first to be able
Mm.
to then really feel the muscle as they train it after those pre-exhaustion sets. It's the little things that you just laid out where when we all go to listen to a presentation, it's like, that's one little thing, and then you write it down. So you've given a lot of those, and they're just, those little nuggets go a long way.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned pre-exhaust sets, because that is actually something that was new to me in this training program as well. And the thing that also might not be so surprising to the listeners or to your followers, but certainly were to mine, was that my training program didn't change. Like in the last year and a half, so just to give a bit of context, I started this September 2022. I did, or was in a calorie surplus for 8 months and successfully did put on about, half a pound or so per month. Uh, then I stayed at maintenance for 4 months over the course of the summer. I didn't want to feel too fluffy. Went back into a surplus over the last 7 months, and now I'm back at kind of a maintenance range. So in that whole time frame, now more than a year and a half, my program has changed twice, and not in a huge fashion. And so many of my clients, after a month, they're like, Lisa, is my program going to change now? And for some people, in the beginning, especially if they're people that are like quote unquote transitioning out of CrossFit and they're used to daily changes, for
Yeah.
some people, I will change it a little bit more often, maybe monthly. But to the rest, I say, hey, it's absolutely fine if your program is the same 8, 12, 16 weeks, whatever. The goal here is progressive overload. As we know, the goal here is for you to activate and to learn that mind muscle connection. And that is really difficult if your stuff is changing all the time, because you're just so getting used to a new exercise, you're getting used to a new machine. What kind of weight am I using? How many reps was that again? What's the rest time? You're so distracted by so many things. So with that variety, it makes it so much harder to actually progressively overload, and or not, yeah, progressively overload, but more than anything, to learn to specifically feel that one particular muscle. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in there. And in regards to the gaining overall, that seems or might seem like a really long time for people, or maybe particularly for females, and like thinking, oh, that much time in a calorie surplus. As I said, I was scared as well. And I really, really do think that remaining accurate during this time and still tracking very accurately. I mean, you know that I eat out a lot, but nonetheless, in this whole time, there hasn't been a day that I didn't track. And that doesn't mean that this has to apply for everybody. Some people are absolutely fine having, some off days, or when they go on vacation, taking some time off. But I will also say, the more days where you're not tracking at all, where you're not even bothering to estimate things when you're eating out and so on, just the higher chances you're gonna feel fluffier the next day, the higher your chances you're gonna want to go into a cut too soon before giving it sufficient time to actually show effect. And then you might be in that horrible cycle of like, oh, hey, you've been building for 3 months, and then you really want to cut, and then you're cutting, and then you're wanting to build again. And you're never really like you're spinning your wheels because you're never devoting sufficient time to actually see some progress. Would you agree with that in terms of what you see in some people?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And one of the things you really touched on something that I know it's just an experience. And to our listeners, if this is you, that's okay. We're not talking down to you, or we're not saying this is a bad thing. But when it comes to the training aspect, where you talk about where you really didn't hardly change your training much, if at all, for so long, people need to remember that the goal of training is to master the lifts, right? Like lifting is an art. So the actual exercises that you do, you want to master those. So there's a reason why LeBron James does chest passes and layups and free throws every single day, because he has to master those, right? So if you think about how many times you've done the chest press machine, right? For example, or just flat dumbbell presses for your chest over and over. I've probably done, I can't tell you how many times over the last 2 to 3 decades, right? But as you keep repeating that, you get better at the lift. And as you get better at the lift, you have a better mind muscle connection. As you get better at the lift, you can actually get stronger and use more weight, which actually increases the load on the muscle. So all these things are tied together. But, if someone just arbitrarily goes into the gym and they just pick exercises, and that's okay, by the way, like that's okay. But if you're really trying to hone in, if you're always jumping around, or you're wanting your coach to change your exercises because you're quote unquote bored, you're never going to master the lifts. So when you take that approach for a decade, for example, you're really leaving some meat on the bone, so to speak. So I just wanted to kind of triple down on that, because I think it's such an important point that you made.
100%. And if you're worried about the, oh, I'm bored with this, you should probably ask yourself, okay, what really is your main goal? I mean, if your goal is more to, hey, I'm doing this more for, a little bit of fun and strength and so on, and you're okay with taking in some cuts on the hypertrophy, and that's okay. Just be conscious of that, and then, be okay with the fact that you might see progress a little bit more slowly, as opposed to, hey, my main goal, I really don't care as much what's on the bar. I'm going to take my ego back here, or I'm okay just feeling into this more. Maybe I can focus on something different. Maybe I can use better music, etc., so that I don't get quite as bored. I think, yes, super, super important part for sure.
Let me know when you're ready for some questions from the listeners, because I've thought of a couple here that I wanted to ask you. But you let me know what part of the presentation you're ready for
Yeah,
that.
I'm almost there. I think I just have, yeah,
Okay, perfect.
a few things to tidy up, and I think a few I mentioned already. So, or we're actually touching on right now. So I said my own struggles were also impatience. It probably was at least 3 or 4 months before I felt I saw any kind of visible progress. Even though I was taking progress pictures, I was taking measurements, my weight was going up at the rate that I wanted it to. But I was like, you see your pictures, you check yourself in the mirror, and I was like, nope, this is not paying off. And I mean, we all know how frustrating that can be. 4 months of putting in the hard work and feeling like you're seeing nothing. If that was a dieting phase and you would be 4 months in and you saw nothing, you would be frustrated as hell. Um, but yeah, really devoting. So my one of my tips is actually devoting sufficient amount of time. And for most people, that is going to be a 1 year minimum for any kind of body part. If it's a minor tweak where you're like, hey, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, or you're just running different cycles, maybe a quarter of the year you're doing like lower body specialization cycle, a quarter of the year, this and that. Yeah, that's a good strategy too. But if you're really focused on one particular body part, I would say give that, a year is really a good time frame. And I already said, check your ego at the door. when you're feeling fluffy, particularly as a female, ask yourself why that might be. So maybe going back to, were you eating out the day before? Was it saltier? Did you just maybe have more carbs, even though you were in your calories? That can always contribute, or in many cases also around ovulation, around your period, and then just getting out of your head and saying, okay, I understand that I might not feel very comfortable. I'm gonna maybe put on some different clothes, not the tightest ones that I have, and knowing that in 3, 4 days time I'm gonna feel like myself again, and just sitting that out and not giving into this immediate urge to like change something or restrict food or go and run it off or whatever it might be. And yeah, being okay with potentially losing strength. For me, that was really, or it is a little bit of a mental disconnect, because many people enter the sport thinking strength has to go up if we want to progressively or if we're progressively overloading, and if we're wanting to see hypertrophy. We know, you and I know, that that doesn't have to be the case. Clearly, the strongest people in the world are not necessarily the most muscular ones, and likewise, the most muscular people in the world are not necessarily the strongest. Yes, there is some overlap, particularly in the first few years of training. And, particularly, let's just say between 6 and 10 reps, etc., we are likely building a bit of strength. But in my case, in order to disconnect certain muscle groups and engage others, I had to lose overall strength for some time. Yeah, of course, also, again, progress pictures really helpful. But I would also say don't take them too often, because if I would have taken mine, yeah, a couple of times a week or so, I would have been even more
Yeah.
discouraged. So initially, maybe even every 2 weeks, can it probably even be once a month if you really wanted to. Once a week is okay too, but just be okay with not seeing huge differences from one week to another. And for me, or for many females, I don't think that a large surplus really is needed. I think that can often lead to feeling too uncomfortable too quickly, and then gaining too much body fat with that. And then when you're cutting, you're not just losing the fat, but also the muscle again. So, yeah, I think for me, that would not have worked as long. I certainly would not have stayed as patient for as long if I would have been in a larger surplus. And I'm not sure I would have gotten more muscular gains out of it necessarily. And then, of course, accountability. For me, I announced it on my social media when I started it, and that in and of itself was a huge accountability factor for me. And then a couple months later, I was like, hey, I really actually want to have a coach. I mean, I know I'm a coach, but also you and I know how helpful it is for coaches to have a coach as well. So that was super helpful, just kind of being able to hand my brain over to that person and just following her macros, following her training, etc., and not always thinking I know everything better.
Yeah, coaches need coaches. Like if you look at
Hmm.
some of the most successful people out there, we all have coaches or mentors or someone that's going to help us reach that next level. So, and then you learn from that person, and then you take what you learn from another coach and you put it as a tool in your toolbox, and that's how you level up. So, I've had numerous coaches over the years. I still have people that I go to that I consider coaches and mentors. So, I think that's perfect. I do want to touch on something real quick, the slow gain. And I think that's something that is probably the hardest of all, even though if we're talking about females, definitely you all have a little bit more pressure on you because of social media. Like back before social media, it was magazines and all this stuff. Right now it's social media at scale. So like the feeling of being, use the word fluffy, just heavier, like uncomfortable, that's something to where if you just go into a slight maintenance like you talked about, that's something to where a lot of people aren't going to gain a bunch of body fat that way. Body fat, I always tell my clients when I add calories, right? If I've got a lady at 1800 calories, and maybe that's a slight surplus for her, right? Depending on the person, maybe it's 2000 for somebody, but I'm like, you're not really going to gain a lot of body fat on these daily calories. It's the days that you go and you eat off the plan and you eat a bunch of extra stuff, like those are the days that add up. So the way that you did it was a very slight surplus, protein high enough. And if you don't mind, if you remember them off the top of your head, especially your protein intake, let some of the ladies know what your protein intake was like, because this was
Sure.
over the course of, you said what, like 14 months or something. So
Yeah,
what
the
was your
one picture to
protein?
another for 14 months. So my protein actually stayed pretty much the same. It was 130, so that's just a bit over. That's like 1.1 gram per pound of body weight or something like that. So a little bit, I wouldn't say higher. I've had my protein higher before at 145 or so. I've never really had it since tracking macros, never really had it below 125. But yeah, 130 works really well for me. And so I mean, my maintenance for my body weight, I don't know exactly what it is in pounds. When I started, that was at about 53 kilos. So let's just say 120-ish, 22
Yeah.
pounds or so. And then the end, or the one picture was like 57, I believe. So you know, closer to what would that be? Like a 9 pound increase or something like that, maybe a bit
Yeah.
more. Um, but yeah, basically, my maintenance calories before that, when starting, was about 2,100, and so then I brought it up, or no, it was 2,000. Sorry, 2,000. I brought it up to 2,200, and then 15% brought it up to 2,300 in after a couple of months. And yeah, I mean that is for someone my size, that's a pretty good maintenance calorie
Yeah.
level. So I've, you know, over the course of the years, built up a very good metabolism by not dieting too much, by doing all the
Yes.
things that we have been speaking about. Because going into this, it was not like I've come out of gazillion cycles of restrictive dieting right then and there.
Yeah. The other thing too, I think, even though 2,100, 2,200, 2,300 calories sounds like a lot, for some females, I can get quite a few females there if they're very diligent tracking their food like you track it. Like,
Precisely.
I would rate you, you eat out a lot, but you still track it. So, I
Hmm.
mean, that's still a 9.5 out of 10. The only reason it's not a 10 out of 10 is because it's the human error, the people cooking the food. It's not you. So when you track that closely, you can get your calories up high like that for a lot of people. It's when people are being so loose, they can't get those trackable calories up because they're having a bunch of other stuff, and it is leading to body fat gain. And so they try and keep the calories a little lower, but really it's the inaccuracies, or not tracking as closely as they should. Um, I've thought of a really good question here that I know a lot of people are thinking about, and that comes back to, you went to train lower body 3 times a week, and this is something for a lot of people. And if you already said this, then I'm sorry for repeating it. But training the body part that you want to bring up with the most volume and the most frequency is very, very important. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, th that is one of the quote unquote easiest ways to really manipulate or to really focus on hypertrophy in that particular body part. So, I mean, even though according to science, in order to be able to stimulate muscle growth. Ideally, we do want to hit a body part um, twice a week, more or less. I mean, it doesn't have to be. You've talked about successful splits with where you do a body part only once a week, but then the volume just has to be so high in that one day. That's
Yeah.
kind of the thing. And you know, if I tried to cram everything, all the volume that I wanted to for my glutes into one day, I would have been so sore. I probably wouldn't have been able to to walk for several days. And then by the time the next training rolls around, you're also dreading it and so on. So for me personally, it just works a lot better to spread a high volume across the week. So I mean, how big that increase has to be really depends on where you're starting as well. And we've said in some episodes before that sometimes seeing progress actually means reducing the volume depending on where you are. But because my volume was so low, I actually, you know, my training sessions don't really go longer than 60 minutes, maybe 70 at the most. So that includes a warm up, and that includes maybe 5 minutes of foam rolling or so, or 10 minutes of foam rolling. So, and that shows you that I do not have a ton of volume in one session. I personally just recover better from that or through that. I can't unfortunately tell you off the top of my head what the exact number was in terms of sets for my glutes. I've never calculated it that way, to be honest. But many people say, kind of sort of like 10 sets, isn't it, per muscle group that we want to have as a minimum in a week. And I most certainly was like, yeah, way beyond that for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure. I especially hitting it 3 times a week. So if you're training lower body 3 times a week, were you training upper 2 days a week? Were you,
So yeah, initially because my and it was that's not very clear from the picture here, but initially my biceps or my arms in general are just were very developed from CrossFit mostly as well. And so that was another thing that several people said to me, "Hey, if you want to, look kind of like a bikini competitor even without stepping on stage, your biceps actually needs to reduce." So I had to cut out my arm training. I like, literally at this point I haven't done quote unquote arms in over a year and a half. And so I basically initially had 3 lower body days and 1 shoulder day, and then 3 off days. And then after half a year, because I actually love training upper body. After that, we added in a back day now. So now I'm doing 3 lower, 1 shoulder, 1 back, and still no arms. So I haven't done a bicep curl or yeah, anything like that in a long time.
yeah, it's something to where sometimes I'll have someone hire me and they have such a dominant body part. For example, a guy might just have a massive, massive chest. Well, if I'm trying to bring his back up, for example, I'm going to have him train back at least twice a week, and he might train his chest once a week because it's just a standout body part. It grows well. It's solid. Sometimes I've even had them train chest once every 10 days if their chest is just overpowering. That way, all the food they eat, the training, all of that goes towards building his back with more priority. This chest is not going to shrink. It's not going to go away. Obviously, you quit training biceps for a year, they still look amazing, but it let
Well,
your other body parts catch up, right?
Exactly. And I mean, the thing is that we forget that the volume to maintain muscle mass is really so low, like
It is.
so low. And number two, even when doing shoulders or now back as well, the bicep is still involved. It's
Yes.
involved as a supporting muscle, right? Like, I mean, when I do my lateral raises or other things, it's still in rowing and in things like that, still involved. It might not be, I'm certainly not as strong in terms of if I were to do a bench press now for sure, or maybe even my push-ups might have gone down. But I'm okay with that. So I think
Yeah.
it's all about, expectations, what's important to you if you want to have the most well-rounded strength or so, then obviously think about this a bit differently or construct your training a little bit differently. But in general, for me, this has worked really well.
Yeah. It certainly the pictures are the proof. The proof's in the pudding, so to speak.
Awesome. Did you have some other questions that you were thinking of?
No, those are all that I've thought of. This has been a great presentation. Do you have anything else to cover?
No, thank you. I mean, for those of you just listening, so on this final slide, I literally just have a few phrases or a few things that were important to me throughout this journey. I mean, continuous improvement in general, that's one of my life mottos, and I know for you as well, just striving to achieve the best possible physique, whatever that means for you at whichever stage in life. The other thing that's on there is consistency over perfection, and more than anything with this, as I mentioned, I was consistent with my tracking. I was trying to be consistent with my recovery work. Of course, we all live lives. Things happen. I always think, if we're consistent with most things, 80, 90% of the time, that's still a win. So don't ever, even with the consistency, don't try to be perfectly consistent. Be just try to be consistent. And yeah, for me, there is at this stage, I don't have a particular goal or finish line. And some people struggle with this. And initially, I struggled with that too. I thought I had to have, in order to do something like this, I had to have a particular date to step on stage or to have a photo shoot and so on. And then I just acknowledged for myself, I don't have to have that. While it can be helpful for motivation for some people, or even for myself in a certain regard, um, It's not necessary. So if you listening or watching are someone too who's like, I don't actually have those aspirations, why should I even push myself to that? Just do it for you. Do it for the fun of it. Do it for the experiment of what it could be like. Of, you might have a person in mind that you have been idolizing or who you think has a great physique, and that too might be possible for you, but you'll never know until you try. So you can do that as well, even if you don't have any particular dates or so. I just wanted to throw that out there as sort of the last thing to say, and maybe that's inspiring to someone else also.
Yeah, this has been a great presentation. I loved that presentation the first time I saw it at the Fat Muscle Academy. Even better the second time through. It really got my wheels turning to think about some questions that would help our listeners. And if you ever do have questions, by the way, all of our contact information is in the show notes. It's in the description if you're watching on YouTube. Feel free to drop any questions that you have if you're watching on YouTube down in the comments. We go through, we answer all of those, and we love the community that we have and being able to chit chat back and forth. And if you have other tips that you think maybe were left out on this presentation that either one of us didn't cover, throw those in. So I really love the engagement that we have on our YouTube page. I really like these topics. We have more fun stuff coming up. You're going to be giving another presentation coming up here in the future. What's that one going to be on? Let our listeners know so they can
So
watch for it.
that one's going to be a top five tips for coaching females in particular, since my clients tend to be mostly females. But our next full-length episode is actually going to be around training around injuries, which I think ties in well with the sciatic nerve thingy here. But in general, I mean, who hasn't had an injury and who doesn't think like, oh shit, I've gotten injured, like what should I do? Should I just train through it or should I continue? Should I pause? What should I do? So hopefully that'll be valuable to people also.
Yeah, we also have a question of the week coming up next. What's that going to be on?
This is going to be tips for travel. You and I both are on the road quite a bit, so hopefully we can provide some good insights.
Yeah, and we have some more presentations coming soon. I'm going to give a presentation on HIIT versus steady state cardio, breaking down
Cool.
all the science, talking about all the craziness that I've done with clients because I've had them do some crazy stuff to test things out in the trenches. I don't know if we'll drop that with Fat Muscle or with Elite Physique University, kind of our sister podcast and presentation network on the YouTube channel. But we have more stuff like that coming up. So, Lisa, once again, this was a great presentation. We look forward
Thanks.
to hearing from everyone again soon. For myself and Lisa, we're out of here. See you guys.